Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor, and today on the show we have Auto Trader's Ian Plummer. Hello, Ian.
Hi there, good afternoon.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, just a bit of brief background about Ian. He's Auto Trader's commercial director, and his primary job is growing Auto Trader's new car business and builds those relationships with the manufacturers and dealers. He's a familiar face in the industry as he was Director of Sales Operations for Volkswagen UK, and he's been Managing Director of Renault Retail Group in the past. He is then the perfect man to talk about what's going on in the new and used car markets at the moment. Okay, Ian, right, thank you very much for coming on. Firstly, have you seen anything quite like what we're seeing at the moment in the used car market? You know, it's frantic action that we're seeing, and also in the new car market where it's being surprisingly buoyant whilst being under intense pressure.
I think the short answer is probably no. The level of demand we're seeing now is probably a reflection of clearly the fact that the market was paused, but we always said it wasn't stopped. So clearly that leads to the delivery now of a certain level of pent-up consumer demand. An awful lot of people out there are suffering sort of financial consequences of the tough times that we're going through, but many others are still in the market for a car and still absolutely need personal mobility. And so they're coming back into the market since they've been sort of held back from it for 3 months or so. So that's being seen quite clearly, as you touched on, in both used and new car demand. Used turned upwards earlier than new cars. I think new cars generally takes a little longer to get going, but both are now performing very strongly, and demand seems fortunately to be holding firm as we speak as well.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, with new cars, they tend to be more expensive, and so consumers tend to be slightly more reluctant to actually buy something unseen during lockdown. But also, you know, with new cars, consumers tend to like to test drive them, and there's more of the traditional way of buying a car, isn't there? Whereas with used, it's a different scenario, isn't it?
Well, used, clearly the car is a unique item, and the smart retailers recognise that, and they put a lot of effort into the merchandising of each of their cars and the digital forecourt that they bring to the fore in front of the audience that's out there looking, and then hopefully translate that into an opportunity to engage with the consumer. That we saw an awful lot of consumers, whether on new or used, through the period of the lockdown, engaging obviously even more digitally because they frankly couldn't engage physically with retailers. As we've opened back up again since June, the level of demand has carried on being just as strong. The engagement digitally is equally carrying on at the same levels. People are now able to sort of obviously enter into the physical discussions with retailers, usually on the basis of fixed appointments to manage the flows and the safety measures and so on. But we're definitely seeing the benefits of that digital acceleration that happened during lockdown, and that's helping the used car journey, which, as I said, has always been very transparently focused on advertising quality and merchandising. That's also happening now in new car, and we're trying to play our part in doing the same thing for new cars as for used, which is bringing that transparency that consumers want to that market, and that's helping too.
Yeah. So what kind of activity have you seen, you know, with the number of leads being sent to dealers, the activity, the increase in activity since dealers were able to reopen on June the 1st? What type of things have you been seeing?
Well, firstly, the audience we're seeing at the moment is at a record level. We're now at, you know, after a great month of June with a 29% increase in visits year on year. We're carrying on at the same sort of trend with July, 23% up year on year. So the audience is really strong. But what's quite noticeable as well is that car buyers seem to be engaging even more than ever on the site. They're spending a little longer on the site per visitor, and they're generating, as you said, a significant amount more leads. Our research shows that they're actually also keen to do more touch points, if you like, through the car buying process and the jobs they've got to get done when buying a car. They're keen on doing more of them digitally than ever before. Further down the funnel, they're still very keen on actually engaging with the retailer, getting advice, seeing the physical car before purchase and so on. But the lead volumes is the real translation, if you like, as you touched on, of that high level of audience number and the initial level of interest into a sale. So we've got lead volumes that are 96% higher in June actually compared to prior year. They're still 71% up year on year for July. In new cars, that took a little longer to grow. We were up in the three figures though quite recently, and at 154% growth year on year. So both sides of the market, excuse me, are progressing very strongly with that return to leads. And from what we can see, that's translating further through the funnel, if you like, into actual sales. So new car was a little slower, as we saw last month, to pick up. We were a bit down in retail compared to prior year. But I think a lot of that was the lack of push to close the month. And from what we're seeing just now and hearing from our retailer partners, new cars is performing extremely strongly now in July, hot on the tails of a really hot performance from used cars in June too. And I think more to come now this month as well.
Yeah, I mean, we had one interview on Cardio Live this week with Wayland's CEO, John O'Hanlon, was saying that balance between new and used was getting to 50% now, whereas, you know, in the last couple of months, it's been very much in the favour of used. Can I just talk to you about services like Click and Collect? Now, there must have been an increase in people, you know, opting for that kind of service during lockdown, purely because of the ease and the convenience of it.
We certainly saw a lot more interest in those kind of functionalities. We put in place a lot of work as soon as we went into lockdown to prepare a certain amount of additional functionality that we knew would be relevant, and we grew in confidence of the choices we were making as we learned from the experience of other countries who'd exited lockdown earlier than us. So, for example, Click and Collect, very good case in point, but there are other things we added to full page ads, such as the ability of the retailer to allow a consumer to understand their sort of sanitary measures, how well they've managed social distancing, appointment processes, and so on. And that gave great reassurance to consumers, whether sort of clicking and collecting or even turning up at the retailer, of course. But equally, higher up, if you like, in the purchase funnel, we created an instant video opportunity, adding that also to the full page ad. And then the home delivery option. And it became obvious from around sort of the early part of May that we needed to bring those solutions into the market. We waited until the right moment, until the legislation and the government advice was relevant to allow us to do that and allow retailers to operate safely in that way. But clearly, we saw that in that period, 8 in 10 car buyers, or car seekers, I should say, were actually quite happy at the idea of doing all of their car buying only to actually pick up the car physically from the retailer. A smaller amount, probably around the mid-teens, are actually keen on going all the way through to a sort of full click and collect journey, like you said. But it's still a sizable amount of people who would be very keen on that option.
So, when it comes to used car prices, I mean, what trends have you been seeing there in terms of, you know, the types of car being popular and the fuel types?
That's a great question, and a lot of different sort of details to give you on that one. Firstly, the trend. The overall trend is clearly one of sustained growth, and actually, despite some predictions that growth might sort of curtail quite quickly, we're seeing it accelerate even now. So we saw sort of very flat levels of price stability, if you like, at the initial phase of lockdown. Then we started to see positive numbers. Last month, we saw a 4.4% increase. Beg your pardon, last month 3.7%. This month, first week was 4.4%, and that's actually growing to 4.7% in the week just gone, the second week of July. So it seems like the trend is continuing. It seems like the balance of supply and demand is probably slightly out of kilter. Supply is picking up again now, but we don't expect that to knock the trend sideways. And we really recommend that we keep our eyes very firmly focused on the real-time data and the pricing tools that we're able to share with our industry partners in order to focus on that and not a sort of an opinion-led approach. Yeah. And in terms of the trends, there were various key themes that stood out during the lockdown period. Firstly, we saw that there were premium cars that fared better than the volume players during the lockdown. That started to change as we entered the sort of the opening period, and retailers were able to open their doors from the beginning of June, of course. And at that point, volume really picked up the pace and came back, not quite still in line with premium, but there was perhaps an initial phase where people were aspirationally looking at fantastic cars and wishing they could buy one of those great premium models. Equally, cheaper cars, they fell at the beginning of lockdown further and faster than premium did. And the higher priced used cars, I would suggest, not necessarily always premium models, but they picked up quicker and faster more recently, again, as people probably get in the transaction mode, their prices also at the moment are accelerating slightly quicker than the average of the market, but equally the demand level per se isn't necessarily higher. It's just probably a reflection of the balance of supply and demand. And the last point I pick out in the sort of trends would be the fuel type sort of disparity. We talked a lot during lockdown, didn't we, around the fact that the air was cleaner and we'd hear the birds singing and so on. I think environmental awareness has definitely grown, and that's no bad thing for all of us. But during lockdown, people resorted more than ever to what they knew best, and that these days is petrol, not so much diesel. And the alternative fuel vehicles, hybrids and electric, have started to come back more recently, but actually aren't getting the level of share that they were pre-lockdown. And that's probably an area of opportunity as brands bring out lots more electric vehicles in the months to come, and that awareness translates into sales, given that already we've got a huge level of interest in those cars, but just probably a lack of stock as well.
Yeah, because I was looking at your data about the fastest and the selling cars in June, and the top 5 slower selling cars were all hybrids, in particular plug-in hybrids. And that is, I looked at that and I was actually quite surprised because petrol plug-in hybrids and diesel plug-in hybrids as well are very much, they're in fashion, aren't they? And they are this new technology which is becoming ever more available to consumers. And yet it would seem as though they're not selling particularly well, and they are hanging around on dealer forecourts.
Well, we do honestly face something of a confusing situation in the UK, because we look at the rest of Europe and see great incentive programs put in place generally across automotive, and adding specific interest, obviously, also for electric, but also for hybrid. In this country, we don't have those sort of renewed levels of incentive. We've got an existing incentive tailored down from where it used to be and removed from hybrid. So I think we've confused consumers, and we started doing that probably 3 years ago, and we confused them on diesel and demonized diesel. And now we're not really spurring them forward into buying electric. And we've taken away that great step that used to be the hybrid. So the consumer's looking at this and actually thinking, I'm interested. 77% of people in our latest survey earlier this year said that they were considering an electric vehicle or a hybrid. But obviously, as we know, those numbers of sales are down in the single digits. So we've got a big gap that we've got to bridge, essentially one of price. And either the government needs to help bridge that, or the brands and the retailers need to, but they clearly won't be able to sell a car at a loss. And I think we need to collectively find a way to really change that dynamic and enable more people to get into those cars. And if you look just simply at the new car disparity, you've got a price gap, usually simplistically, I'd say around 20% between an EV and an ICE equivalent. On a used car on our platform, typically the actual average price of an AFV is probably around double the average price of a petrol equivalent. So, that's a heck of a step for somebody who can't necessarily afford that average price of the AFV, which is around £25,000 at the moment. And that would be an awful lot of people, obviously. So a lot more to be done to bring that sort of road to zero to life, I think, in the UK.
Yeah, and it is a big issue, isn't it? We've got this ban on pure petrols and diesels that's been brought forward from 2040 to 2035, and yet we're told that hybrids and plug-in hybrids aren't included. They're included in the ban. And so if we're taking away one of those stepping stones to, a pure EV, for example, we could actually get to a stage where the used car market, people actually just turn to petrols and diesels because they're familiar with them and they won't actually buy new.
Well, that's exactly what we have seen during lockdown, as I touched on earlier. People have resorted to what they know best, and that today is petrol, quite clearly. Diesel's seen a decline in its share of searches when people actually specifically choose a particular fuel type quite dramatically over the last few years. And the AFVs have grown. But that confusion that we talked about is absolutely relevant in what we're seeing. And the steps that need to be relevant for consumers are all more relevant when you think that the 2035 deadline you touched on could well be brought forward to 2032. There's consultation underway for that. It could even be brought forward to 2030, where campaigners would suggest it should be, even at the latest. If you consider where we are right now, mid-2020, you could say we've got a 12-year period to go. But given that the average cycle of a car in the UK is around 3.4 to 3.5 years, the transaction cycle, that gives most people probably 3 cars to go before they get into the sort of situation where they're obliged, if they are at least buying a new car, to go towards electric vehicles. So we need to encourage people to take those steps now rather than push the pile of sand further down the road.
Yeah.
And I think if you consider that consumers have a lot of choices in buying a car, we did some research recently that showed that there were a significant amount of jobs to be done. Consumers start the journey thinking there are around 3, maybe 5 jobs to be done. When they actually get to it and that lists them all out, and we did a lot of detailed qualitative and quantitative analysis on this, you get to around 25 jobs. Add in the fuel types and things like subscriptions you might need for an EV, and you've got another 5 or 6 on top of that. But actually, when you look at how we've confused consumers in the UK with government policy in the last few years, the CO2 levels of cars, new cars sold in the UK in the last 3 years have risen. And that's simply because we put people off diesel. Instead of going to buy an electric or a hybrid, they went and bought a petrol that probably was worse for CO2s, maybe better for nitrogen oxide, but not always, but definitely not so good for CO2. Now the manufacturers have a CO2 target to achieve at a European level. Then they're having to bring their average CO2s down below this 95 grams level that I'm sure you know of. And so we've got the pressure point there, an opportunity, but a pressure point on EVs as well. But generally for a consumer, I think we all, Auto Trader included, need to really take the challenge of making it easier for people to make an environmentally friendly choice. Not necessarily an EV, but a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I mean the interesting thing is, you say that consumers are 3 cars away from that time frame, but it's even shorter for manufacturers. As you and I both know, manufacturers are already looking at cars for that time frame at this precise moment in time, and they've got to know that these cars are going to be popular, and they're going to be encouraged. People are going to be encouraged to buy them in the early 2030s, and at the moment I don't think as though the manufacturers are getting a positive reception.
Well, I think that's a slightly more nuanced view that I'd give. I think, as I said, the consumer is interested now. The awareness of environmental issues has grown. Before lockdown, we did some research that showed that the car buyer actually has a high level of awareness. 91% of them are aware that cars have an impact on the environment, and they would like to do something about that. And that number's grown quite significantly in the last year or so. And that's, again, before we had the pleasure of hearing the birds sing and so on, and smelling cleaner air in our cities during lockdown. So I think that awareness has only grown further, and a lot of people consider electric vehicles. The manufacturers have brought amazing cars to the market. You used a couple of years ago to look beyond the likes of Renault, Nissan, and a few pioneers who had some great cars already back then. But most cars that have been around have created this idea in consumers' minds that they're probably a little bit geeky, a little bit gadgety, and slightly odd. And most brands had one. And it was a little bit of an exercise in trying to make sure they had at least one. And maybe they learned from that, or it was good for PR. Now, clearly, they're way beyond that. They've invested huge sums in R&D, in tooling and platforms, and reconfiguring their factories. So they are sunk now. Their costs are definitely sunk into EVs. They have no choice. The regulation's going that way. So I think you will find that consumers, since they want it and the brands are bringing those cars to market, they will end up becoming our currency of tomorrow. And I think consumers will challenge themselves to actually make them work. And my personal view is that I think we should challenge ourselves to look at the odd journey we take here or there that might need a car with a 600-700 mile range. Well, I might be able to hire one for that, or subscribe to one for that day or that week, like when we go on holiday. And the rest of the time, I'm probably great with a second generation EV that now looks great. There isn't just one anymore. There's a whole range in most of the brands' sort of cases. So there's a small one, medium one, an SUV one, and so on, or a sporty one. And they also perform really well with a range of 2, 3, even more 100 miles. So I think we've got rid of the range anxiety, maybe still got a refueling anxiety, but there is an absolute opportunity there for brands to lead. And there are 34 electric or hybrids models coming into the UK during the course of this year. And I think the biggest noise you'll see coming from a manufacturer marketing department in terms of their spend and the adverts they'll do will typically be around those cars. So that will only boost consumer awareness and interest further.
Let's just talk about online car sales at the moment. So obviously during lockdown, people obviously turn to the internet to research and in some cases buy their new car, used or new, through the internet. But that balance really has changed now, isn't it? That trend towards more people wanting to transact online. I mean, it's been a long time coming, hasn't it? But coronavirus has really catalysed it.
Well, we've seen a huge digital acceleration, obviously, across the UK. I think as a country, we are far ahead of the game against all the other indicators from economic, our economic peers, if you like, in the rest of the world in terms of our engagement with online buying. Recently, the ONS even said that we went from 1 in 5 products, I beg your pardon, retail products bought online to 1 in 3 in the space of a year. And that trend is what we're used to as consumers overall. In virtually all categories, we engage with products online, and we're used to transparency of the product and the price, and we're used to be able to click and get that product delivered to us, or maybe go and collect it. That hasn't been possible in cars, but that same digital acceleration has now happened, probably a little bit forced, because consumers wanted to engage with cars, retailers wanted to sort of link with the consumer. And by definition, that created the real need to do something more and create this sort of digital showroom that consumers could look at. And now that brands and retailers alike are seeing the benefits of that, they're able to think about maybe how they could reshape their business in a different way, in a smarter way, working on omni-channel, to give the buzzword, but across the different touch points, physical and digital ones, on their own platform, on sites like ours, brand platforms and so on, to really give a consumer transparent experience that's likely to do just what the other retailer segments have managed to do, that automotive has been slightly behind. But I'm really delighted to see that the car industry now is really embracing that opportunity, and it is an opportunity to give more to the consumer, to give them a better, faster experience. And our research says 1 in 3 will buy cars more often if it's easy to do, and equally to retain more value in the industry.
We've been reporting on this topic a lot in the past few weeks, which is this supply of used cars. There are, dealers are clamoring and fighting amongst each other to get hold of used stock. And then the supply chain issue is causing a lot of frustrations. Are you seeing similar things? Are you hearing similar concerns?
We are hearing similar concerns. I mean, there are many reports from some of our retailer partners that, for example, they're seeing part exchange volumes that are down as much as 15% or so. And we're seeing a lot of the if you like, the reverse angles of an otherwise great opportunity. The opportunity being that there are new customers coming into the market. Research we've done shows that 56% of UK driving license holders who don't currently own a car are now considering purchase. An awful lot are looking to avoid public transport. On our site recently, a survey confirmed that 11% of our on-site users who are actually confirming also that they're looking specifically to buy a car, they're not just browsing, for example, are looking to do so in order to avoid public transport. So that means that new buyers are coming to the market, but they're turning up at the retailer. Like I said, they don't have the part exchange in quite the same volume as before. The first problem. Second is that the auctions were a little slow to open. They're starting to sort of revitalise now, but I think some earlier than others managed to engage digitally, and I think the likes of Manheim and our own dealer auction joint venture with Manheim accelerated that again, that trend of doing things simpler, faster, smarter online rather than necessarily physically. But that is now creating more fluidity. And lastly, I'd say that the new car side of things, as we said earlier, was a little slower to get going. And whether it be the retail side we touched on, but also the likes of Motability, the transactions were delayed a little bit for Motability, for leasing companies and so on as well. So as they're now coming back into the market, those players, there is more fluidity from a Motability returning vehicle to replace, to come back into the part exchange, the world and the remarketing world in return for obviously the new Motability delivery that's now going out this month, I think, in quite significantly larger volumes. So the new car market has really helped now ease some of those concerns. I think they're still there. There is still a tight level of supply. Overall, that's not a bad place to be in, because as we said, that maintains the values we're seeing. And as long as retailers are able to source enough vehicles priced by using the data, I think they're in a solid position.
Finally, Ian, I mean, can you sort of name the top things which you predict on seeing in the new and used car segments over the next few months?
I think there'll probably be 3 key highlights here. Firstly, the digital acceleration point that I've touched on a few times. consumers want to engage with cars more digitally. They want more transparency. I think we are well on the way now to engaging retailers, brands, and consumers alike to come together to work to deliver that. Secondly, I think that theme that I touched on there is partnership. I think across the industry, we're really focusing on delivering an omni-channel experience, whether it be retailers and their brands working smarter together, but equally with third parties like ourselves, where we know that we have a huge audience and 60% of the time spent on site by consumers out there is on Auto Trader. We need to work cleverly to share data. That will flow me into my third point, which is in fact just that, data. I think, as I touched on regarding valuations in particular, but not just there, whether you're sharing data to power solutions, to power even websites, but also I'll come back to the pricing point, using data to drive decision making and helping you to actually reshape your business in a smarter way is probably the way I would encourage everyone to look at the challenging months ahead, but hopefully the months and years of opportunity as well. And I think there will be opportunity for those who look bravely at the positives within all of that.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for sharing that fascinating insight, and I really do appreciate you taking your time out of the day to talk to us.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
And if you would like to be involved in the Car Deal Live, please do get in touch with us. But until next time, thank you very much indeed, and bye-bye.